Hey, I'm Lexi, and this is what you should know. Welcome back for part 2 of the Bowraville Murders. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this episode contains information and accounts of deceased persons. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional occupants throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. As I said last week, this case has a lot of contentious issues, and I will, as always, do my best to keep this factual, although I do not promise that I won't rant when I'm upset at how people are acting in this, because people tend to act a fool. I also apologise if you can hear every single galah in the country for some reason out the front of my house. Some of the information in this case will be distressing, and if you feel that may be too much for you, feel free to click off, maybe go listen to something else. Put on your favourite playlist, whatever. You can always join me for the next episode. And if you haven't listened to part 1 just yet, I suggest you start there, as part 2 only ever makes sense if you listen to part 1. Now, let's deep dive into what you should know about the Bowraville Murders. So last week we covered the victims, we discussed what had happened in regards to the bodies being found, and the absolute deplorable behaviour of the police. So let's move on. I will be covering the victims again in this, but a lot more briefly. Part 1 really does tend to cover them a lot more in depth. And let's jump straight into the main suspect. The person that, for all intents and purposes, all signs point to him, but the main suspect is currently being protected by multiple acts, laws and legislation. So I will not name him. But I will say you could probably find that information with a very quick and loose Google. But for legality's sake, because I don't have that much money to my name, let's call him Jim. 25-year-old Jim worked at a tanning factory and was quite tall and had a solid build. Jim was white but often hung around the Aboriginal community, typically supplying alcohol and marijuana to the young part of the population. Think like the older guy who really shouldn't be partying with high schoolers. Some of the community felt rightly suspicious of Jim, as they felt he showed too much interest in the younger women and younger girls of the community. The party Clinton Speedy Duro and his girlfriend Kelly Jarrett went to, incidentally, also had Jim in attendance and had made 2 trips into town that night to buy more beer for the party. Sometime after midnight, Jim started hitting on Kelly and tried to convince her to return to the caravan that he lived on his mother's property. Kelly continued to reject him and stated that she would not be leaving the party without her boyfriend, Clinton. So Jim switched gears and suggested they both come back to his caravan to hang out and offered it up as a place for them to both stay. Both agreed and went back to his yellow Viscount caravan, where they stayed up for a little while watching music videos. Jim offered his double bed to the young couple and said that he would sleep on the fold-out dining table. Kelly felt uncomfortable around Jim and quietly asked Clinton not to leave her alone with him. But that night, Kelly slept deeply, only to wake up alone and nude from the waist down, even though she went to bed fully clothed. Her clothes were on the floor by Clinton's shoes. Once dressed, she walked to Clinton's father's home and let him know that she could not find him. When Thomas Duro went out to look for his son, he bumped into Jim in town. He asked Jim if he knew where Clinton was. Jim told him that he had gone home as far as he knew. But as you know, Clinton was never seen alive again. Jim was identified as a person of interest within days of Clinton's disappearance. On the 4th of February, Jim was interviewed by police. A few days later, the police informed Jim that they would be taking his caravan to forensically search, but also out of fear that the Aboriginal community would trash it. Which, look, there's definitely some stories out there of small country town violence against someone. It definitely does happen, but that still feels like a stretch to say that that's exactly what would happen. Now, the issue I have with this, aside from the part where they then tried to make it sound like the Aboriginal community was going to be violent for the sake of it, was they then gave Jim the time to remove some items and asked him if there was anything he wanted from it, which is just a stupid idea. Why let a potential murder suspect remove potential evidence from a crime scene? That just sounds so stupid. Jim only removed barbells though, which they didn't see as suspicious. But hey, I'm not a forensic investigator or a police officer. What do I know? Forensic investigator Rob Wellings wasn't made aware of the fact that Jim was allowed to remove items for quite a while after the fact, and I can only imagine he would have been pissed. Because again, I reiterate, you do not let a potential suspect remove evidence from a scene of a crime. Like, can we all agree that we just don't let people do that? Like, come on. Detective Wellings went on to describe the caravan as being so dirty that it was more like a squat than a proper home. Unfortunately, while his caravan was searched, it was not forensically searched, which is the whole purpose of why they took it in. But hey, I guess they were more concerned about the Aboriginals trashing it. Days later, when Clinton's body was found, Detective Wellings was brought out to attend the scene. As he examined Clinton's remains, he found a piece of fabric stuffed down the front of his shorts. The fabric was carefully removed, and Detective Wellings felt he had seen this fabric before, as it was identical to the pillowcases in Jim's caravan. Detective Wellings immediately flagged this and notified his team of this revelation. On this, Jim was interviewed again, where he adamantly insisted he had nothing to do with Clinton's death. He did acknowledge the two teenagers had been in his caravan and that he had drinks with Kelly and Clinton while they laid on the double bed. Jim then set his alarm for 5:30 for his 6 a.m. shift at the tanning factory and then went to bed. When the alarm went off that morning, Jim was so hungover that he hit the snooze button and went back to sleep. He claimed he was in that place between awake and asleep when he heard someone get up and leave. At 5:45 a.m, he got up to get ready for work. He then went into the main house and borrowed the keys from his mother's car, as he believed he had missed the ride he was going to get from a co-worker. The co-worker of Jim confirmed they arrived at the caravan a little before 6 and peeked in, only seeing Kelly's feet poking out from under the blankets, but no one else. As he was about to leave the property, he saw Jim pull up to his property in his mother's car. That's suspicious. So is the fact that Jim backpedaled on this and said that he had seen his co-worker arrive in his rearview mirror and returned. Jim told him to go to work without him as he felt he needed to treat his hangover. 20 minutes later, Jim showed up to work and stayed for a couple of hours before returning his mother's car. While back at the property, his voice woke Kelly, who was still asleep in his caravan. Police did not believe Jim's stories as they weren't matching up to anyone else's accounts of events. Multiple stories were showing that Jim was awake when he claimed he was asleep, and his mother's boyfriend had noticed a light on in the caravan around 4:30 a.m. before leaving for his work, and a neighbor saw Jim's mother's car leave the house just before 5 a.m, an hour earlier than Jim said that he had to borrow it. Jim's mother also confirmed that he used blankets similar to the one found near Clinton's body. And with that, Jim was charged with the murder of Clinton Speedy DeRoe. I wish this is where I could end it and say that he spent life in prison. But unfortunately, this is not how it goes. As Evelyn's body and Colleen's clothing was found in the same area, people began to assume the obvious: if Jim would be charged with their murders too. Now, years before all of this went down, Jim had been in a volatile relationship with Colleen's aunt, Allison. This was a 4-year relationship, of which they had a son together. He was described as a big white gorilla who would not take crap from anyone, not even from Allison. This relationship became abusive over time, so much so that while Allison was 7 months pregnant, Jim punched her in the face during an argument. Allison required stitches to repair the damage he did. On another instance, Allison ran away to hide from him. As she hid in bushes nearby, Jim walked up and down the street looking for her, yelling her name with a crowbar in hand, intending on beating her. Things got scarier before Allison finally found the strength to leave. as Jim started collecting guns. During an argument, Allison locked herself in one of the rooms of the house and refused to open the door for Jim. He screamed at her, "You better open the door, or I am going to pull the trigger." Allison came out of the room, only to find a rifle being pointed at her and a pistol being held to his own head. Allison fled, screaming, and the police were called. But Jim wasn't arrested and no charges were made. But they did confiscate his guns, which I guess at the very least is something. The night Allison was able to leave, Jim had too much to drink and passed out. Allison collected some of her things and her son and fled to Queensland to start a new and safe life, where she would be able to bring up her son in peace. I can only wonder what would have changed if these instances had been taken more seriously by police. If he did get charged, rather than a brief slap on the wrist. Colleen Walker Craig was 9 years Jim's junior. On another night, months prior to Colleen's disappearance, there was a party happening in Bowraville when Colleen and Patricia bumped into Jim at the party, and he invited them back to his caravan to watch music videos. Patricia and Colleen agreed when he offered them the ability to sleep in his double bed, and he would sleep alone. He likely made the same offer of sleeping on the fold-out dining table. The next morning when Patricia awoke, she found Jim in bed with them, sleeping. Colleen told Patricia that night she woke up to Jim climbing into bed with them and then trying to have sex with her. So Colleen spent the night being molested by her cousin's father. While she was exhausted, she had managed to mostly fight him off. It was after this that Colleen and Patricia became cautious of being around Jim. Colleen returned home the next day and didn't go back to Bowraville until September of 1990. This was the night she went missing, and at that party, Jim was also in attendance again. Jim's friends were uncomfortable to notice that this full-grown man was paying so much attention to a 16-year-old girl. Allow me to echo the advice of so many women before me. If you're 16 and he's 25 paying that much attention to you, it's not because he thinks you're special or mature. It's because he's disgusting. And he can't compete with the women in the same age bracket as him, so the only thing he has to go by to be impressive is the fact that he's older. If someone that much older than you is flirting with you and trying to make moves, do everyone a favor. Talk to someone in a position of confidence and a position of authority. Reach out to your parents. Call the police. Just anyone, please. That night, Jim was trying to persuade Colleen to spend another night in his caravan, but Colleen told others that Jim was harassing her. She was last seen walking down the alleyway next to the house of the party. Jim was also seen following her. Unfortunately, it was all too similar the night Evelyn Greenup went missing too. Rebecca, which is Evelyn's mother, found herself in Jim's crosshairs as he gave her unwavering attention. He attended the party that night, and after the party was over and Rebecca and her children had gone to bed, Jim stayed behind, hanging around the house. Rebecca's mother asked Jim to leave before going to get changed into her pajamas. When she left her bedroom after getting changed, she didn't see Jim around and assumed he went home. But a few hours later, she was woken up by the cries of Evelyn. The next morning, when Rebecca woke up from an uncharacteristically deep sleep, the first thing she had noticed was that her jeans were unbuttoned and pulled down, and her underwear was pulled to the side. Kelly had reported a similar situation the night Clinton went missing. One big piece of information came from a woman who was staying at the same house as Rebecca. This woman was making up a bottle for her baby and saw Rebecca's mother return to her bedroom after trying to check on Evelyn. She then saw Jim leave Rebecca's room and hurried down the hall to then leave through the front door. She wondered what he had been doing and decided to follow him out. But by the time she had reached the front of the house, Jim was gone. On October 16th, 1991, Jim was arrested for the murder of Evelyn Greenup. The issue became, while the police had a lot of circumstantial evidence, they had next to nothing in physical evidence. This was made worse by the fact that they could not locate the missing remains of Colleen. The Director of Public Prosecutions wanted the cases for Clinton's and Evelyn's murders to be done as a singular trial, but Jim's legal team fought to have each case done as a separate trial. They argued their client would be biasly judged if evidence was presented side by side. It's almost as if that's kind of the point. The fact is, these all have similar strands that have him at the center. I mean, you wouldn't have tried Bundy or Dahmer for each murder individually. But ultimately, the judge ruled in the defense's favor, ordering the cases to be tried separately. And on top of this Sunday from hell, the prosecutors would not be allowed to present information from one case in the other. So it is not allowed to be brought up how similar these cases actually are. Clinton's case had the best information and went first. However, as stipulated, the prosecution was barred from mentioning Evelyn Greenup's murder or the disappearance and suspected murder of Colleen Walker Craig. During 1994, Clinton's case started. While they couldn't discuss the other cases as evidence, Clinton's family felt confident that Jim would be brought to justice. The prosecution argued that Jim spiked Kelly's drink and tried to assault her, but was stopped by Clinton, who was woken up. The theory is Clinton got hit in the head by one of Jim's barbells, and then Jim took the keys and moved Clinton's body to where it was eventually found. The movements of the car were backed up by a neighbor and Jim's co-worker noting its return. Kelly Jarrett was able to give testimony that she woke up that morning with Clinton gone, without his shoes. However, the defense undermined her testimony by bringing up the fact that she had been drinking, and any other testimony provided by Aboriginal attendees of this party was similarly torn down due to the consumption of alcohol. They also called 2 witnesses who had allegedly seen Clinton the day after the party. Jim's mother went to the stand and told the court that she had slept with her keys under her pillow, and that when Jim asked for the keys, she saw it was 5:50 a.m. She also stated that she had never said Jim used blankets like the one found with Clinton, and the police had incorrectly recorded this. My goodness, if only backpedaling was great exercise. The trial concluded on February 18th, 3 years exactly after Clinton's body had been found. His family awaited in silence as they waited for the verdict. The jury, who had no idea of the other charges against Jim, found him not guilty. Clinton's family and friends were heartbroken. Due to this, the prosecution found themselves in a difficult position. They had been defeated by the defense in what would have been the strongest case, and they knew they could not bring the other cases into the next trial. So in a devastating move, the director of public prosecutions decided to drop the other charges. The victims' families were utterly heartbroken that there would be no justice for their family, no justice for their children. The grief they were feeling was only made worse by the failure of the judicial system. When the children went missing, they didn't seem to care. Now they were letting the person believed to be responsible walk away free. The feeling of fury is something I empathize with. The feeling of being let down by those who were supposed to protect you and bring equality and justice is gut-wrenching. However, the community was not willing to give up on their children. Demonstrations were held regularly in Bowraville to show their pain for Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton. In January of 1997, the investigation was opened again by the Commissioner of the New South Wales Police. A new strike force had been created, and their resources were being invested in this case, headed by Detective Gary Jubelin. A seasoned detective, Gary was known for his dedication to solving murders and building a relationship with the families of the victims. Detective Jubelin was absolutely mortified to find this case had not been treated more seriously, and the main prime suspect had been allowed to remove possible evidence from his caravan. Jim had discarded the barbells shortly after retrieving them, and infuriatingly enough, they could not be found now. Understandably, it had been, 6 years since then? Experts suspected that these barbells were used to deal the fatal blow to Clinton. Detective Jubelin focused on building trust with the victims' families and community. He realized how fragile this trust was, so he pushed for everyone to undergo cultural sensitivity training, which is actually extremely helpful. So I give Jubelin props for that, especially considering it was the 90s. That is wildly progressive. Gradually, they were able to build a more positive relationship with the community and were able to make new discoveries regarding this case. This included some very interesting information. This related to an incident that happened after Colleen vanished, but before Evelyn's death. There was a residence in the area called the Women's House. As you can imagine, it was called that because only women lived there. Shortly after Colleen went missing, one of the occupants woke up abruptly at 2 a.m, feeling something was wrong. She looked up and saw a figure of a man in her room. His stance was threatening. She forced herself to sit up. Her movement must have scared the intruder as he fled. She didn't feel comfortable telling investigators during the initial investigation, as she felt the police would not have taken her seriously, which is a common thread for any version of sexual assault as well. So, good job, cops. This fell in line with the theory that Detective Jubilant had in mind, that the 3 disappearances had happened as a part of a string of sexually motivated attacks on Aboriginal women in the community. Evelyn's mother and Clinton's girlfriend had both woken up from a weirdly deep sleep. With their bottom half undressed and their loved ones missing. Some of the other members of the community came forward to say not only was Jim well known for supplying beer and marijuana, but for spiking people's drinks, and also showed predatory interest in young Aboriginal women. During 1998, the strike force provided their findings to the director of the public prosecutions. They suggested they press new charges against Jim for the murder of Evelyn Greenup. It took 18 months, but it was eventually knocked back due to lack of interest. Again, I can't get my head around that, due to lack of interest. I get all the evidence is still currently circumstantial because people are stupid and didn't actually forensically investigate sections that they should have. But come on! What is wrong with people? The community and Strikeforce rallied to have this overturned. It took a further 6 years, but a coronial inquest was launched in 2004 for the disappearance of Colleen and the murder of Evelyn. These people died and disappeared in 1990 and 1991. This is 13 to 14 years later. They are finally doing a coronial inquest because there was a lack of interest. Should they have not done this earlier? I know they pretty quickly rallied to do one for Daniel McComb, and sure it took a little while but a lot less to do one for William Tyrrell. Why did these children have to wait so long? In the coronial inquest, the information for both cases could be provided side by side. The coroner handed down the decision that this could be tried as there was enough evidence for a jury to come to a reasonable conclusion. And while Colleen's body has never been found, the coroner declared that Colleen had died by murder, and there was enough to link all 3 murders together. He added that there was a definite suspicion on Jim, and that he should be tried again. This was actioned, and Jim was charged with the murder, and the court proceedings started in 2006. As Jim had already been acquitted of Clinton's murder, he was not able to be retried of this murder, and the evidence of that case would not be admissible in court, because we had the double jeopardy law. The judge once again ruled that some evidence from Colleen's case couldn't be used in this case, as it could cause the jury to be biased. Which again, I stand to rule that that's a stupid decision, with my absolute zero legal knowledge. But they could mention the women who had woken up to find their lower clothing removed. The prosecution put forward the story that Jim had been in the process of sexually assaulting Rebecca when Evelyn woke up and started crying. In a fit of rage for his sexual exploits being interrupted, he had killed Evelyn, only to then dump her body in bushland. One witness came forward with disturbing comments that Jim had made. One couple had an altercation with him in April of 1990, when Jim had threatened to strangle them and dump their bodies on the same road that Clinton was found on. And while in jail, an inmate came forward saying that Jim had told him that he had killed Evelyn by smashing her head into a wall. But due to the caveats in place, they could not provide all the evidence found by the strike force. And the defense undermined the witness again, saying that one was an alcoholic and the prisoner was spending time in jail for perjury, which if you're not sure what that means, it means he lied under oath. Unfortunately, as 15 years had passed, it was too easy for the defense to tear down the testimonies. On March 3rd, the jury found Jim not guilty. Again, the families of the victims were heartbroken. Again, Jim had escaped justice. In New South Wales, there was the double jeopardy laws that prevented someone who had been found not guilty from being charged a second time. This was changed in December of 2006 due to the campaigning of the families. So the change became that you can retry someone who has been found not guilty if fresh and compelling information had been found. Since then, the case has been brought to light with various podcasts and documentaries, even a book. Jim has since moved from Bowraville and changed his name. From what I could find of him, he now works with disadvantaged youths, which is deeply unsettling. Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton's families are still fighting for justice. And that is very unfortunately where the case stands today. So if you do have any information on this case that could be considered fresh and interesting, please call Crime Stoppers on 1-800-333-000. You can even reach out to them online. You don't have to name yourself. You can in fact go forward anonymously. But do be aware that the defense are a bunch of arseholes, in my personal opinion, as they have knocked back various amounts of information that really could have been used as fresh and interesting, including a meat delivery truck that came across Jim on the road with what looked like an unconscious Aboriginal teenager the night that Clinton went missing. But when it was brought up, it was said that it wasn't new information and it wasn't interesting and it wasn't relevant. Never mind the fact that this was, again, the same night that Clinton went missing on the same stretch of road where he was found. But don't mind me, I'm just going to go scream into a pillow now. That is all I have for you this Monday. I hope you found this all fresh and interesting. Please don't be shy. Swing by and say hello on Instagram. You can find me at What You Should Know Australia. I post pictures relevant to the cases, and I do occasionally post memes, because who doesn't love a good meme? If you have any case recommendations, or if you just want to reach out to say hello and tell me your thoughts and feelings on anything, you can do so by sending me an email to whatyoushouldknowaustralia@gmail.com. And I am once again asking you to stay safe and stay hydrated, and potentially maybe give me a like if you feel so inclined. Until next week, bye!